When I was 13 years old, my father handed me a bag with my clothes and a photo of my mother and told me to leave. No explanation. No argument. Just a flat voice and a pointing finger at the front door. I spent 15 years believing he had simply stopped loving me. Then a letter arrived 11 days after his funeral with a key inside and 4 words in his handwriting: "The truth awaits you." What I found inside that safety deposit box destroyed everything I thought I knew about the night he sent me away. My name is Claire Donovan, and this is the story of the night my father told me to leave, the 15 years I spent building a life without knowing why, and what I found inside a small Iowa bank that changed everything. If this story stays with you, subscribe and drop a like right now. It means more than you know. Warren Donovan was not a complicated man before my mother died. He worked in logistics, came home at the same time every evening, and made pancakes on Saturday mornings without being asked. When my mother Elaine died of a sudden cardiac event 3 weeks after my 9th birthday, the noise went out of our house like air leaving a room. My father went quiet in a way that scared me more than the grief itself. Diane appeared 14 months after my mother's funeral. Soft-spoken, careful manners, an easy smile she deployed with the precision of someone who understood exactly what it was worth. I was 10 years old, and I wanted to like her because my father seemed lighter around her than he had been in over a year. I tried. I set the table when she came for dinner, answered her questions politely, and pretended not to notice the way she watched me when she thought I wasn't looking, steady and evaluating, the way someone watches a problem they are still deciding how to handle. Her brother Richard arrived with the relationship as naturally as furniture. He became Warren's business partner within 6 months of Diane moving in, a transition my father presented as a fortunate coincidence. Richard was charming in the broad, uncomplicated way of someone who had never needed to develop a more sophisticated version of himself. He called my father a smart man, filled every room with easy energy, and had Warren's complete trust within a year. That trust was the most expensive thing my father ever gave away. The changes in him happened gradually enough that I kept adjusting to each one before the next arrived. He stopped asking about school. He started leaving rooms when Diane and I were in them together. He looked at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't name, something between confusion and pain. I told myself he was still grieving. I told myself that if I was patient enough and good enough, whatever had come between us would eventually pass. I was still telling myself those things on the night in November when he knocked on my bedroom door and pointed to a bag by the front door containing my clothes, my school things, and the photograph of my mother I had kept on my nightstand since the week she died. He told me arrangements had been made and that this was the best thing for everyone. His voice had no anger, only a flatness that told me the decision was already made. Diane was not in the room. She didn't need to be. My father's sister Patrice opened her door that night without asking a single question. She held me in her kitchen until I stopped shaking, made tea I didn't drink, and sat across from me until the worst of it passed. I slept in her spare room that night and every night for the next 5 years. She rearranged her entire life to make room for mine without ever treating it as a sacrifice. What she gave me was not just shelter, it was steady proof that an adult could be trusted to stay. Living with Patrice taught me things no classroom ever could. She didn't raise me with rules or discipline, she raised me with consistency, which turned out to be the thing I needed most. Every morning she was at the kitchen table with coffee before I woke up. Every evening she asked how my day had gone and waited for a real answer. She never promised me things she couldn't deliver, and she never pretended the situation was something other than what it was. That honesty, delivered quietly and without drama, rebuilt something in me that the night of the bag had broken. School became the place I put everything I couldn't process anywhere else. I was not naturally the loudest student in any room, but I was relentless in a way that my teachers noticed early. I finished assignments before they were due, asked questions that went beyond what the lesson required, and spent lunch periods in the library when I had nothing better to do with the time. Patrice had worked in that library for 12 years and had quietly made sure the librarian knew to let me stay as long as I needed. I don't know how many afternoons I sat at the back table doing homework while she reshelved books nearby, but the specific comfort of that room, warm, quiet, smelling like old paper, stayed with me long after I left Cedar Falls. I thought about my father constantly during those years, but not always with anger. Sometimes I thought about the Saturday morning pancakes and tried to understand how the man who made them had become the man who pointed at a bag by the front door. I couldn't make those two people fit together. The gap between them felt too large to be explained by grief alone, too deliberate to be simply the result of a broken man making a bad decision. Something had happened between those two versions of my father, and I had no way of knowing what it was. What I did know was that he never called. Patrice's phone number hadn't changed in 20 years and mine was easy enough to find once I had one. Birthdays passed without a message. Christmases came and went. I graduated from high school in a gymnasium 2 towns over from where I had grown up, and I looked out at the audience the way I always did on those occasions, not hoping anymore, just checking, the way you check a habit you know is pointless but can't fully stop. He wasn't there. I earned a full scholarship to the University of Iowa and left Cedar Falls the August after graduation with 2 suitcases and the specific kind of relief that comes from putting distance between yourself and a place that holds more pain than memory. Law school followed, then a clerkship in Chicago, then a position at a firm that handled civil litigation. I was good at the work in the way that people are good at things they have needed since childhood. I understood how to find the gap between what someone claimed and what the evidence actually showed. And I was patient enough to keep looking until the gap became impossible to ignore. I had been in Chicago for 4 years when Patrice called to tell me my father was ill. She said it carefully, the way she always delivered difficult things, giving me the information and then leaving space for me to decide what to do with it. I thanked her and told her I needed to think. Then I went back to the brief I had been working on and didn't think about it for 3 days, which was its own kind of answer. He died 6 weeks later. Patrice called again with the same careful voice. I flew back to Cedar Falls for the funeral and sat in the back row of a church I hadn't entered since my mother's service, watching people I didn't recognize fill the pews. Diane sat in the front row in dark clothes with a composed expression that told me nothing. Richard sat beside her looking heavier and older than the version of him I carried in my memory. I left before the reception without speaking to either of them. 11 days after the funeral, the envelope arrived. The key was small and ordinary, the kind that could open almost anything. The business card belonged to a law office I didn't recognize. The note was 4 words in my father's handwriting on a piece of notepaper that smelled faintly of the cedar closet where he had always kept his important papers. I sat at my kitchen table in Chicago holding that note for a long time before I did anything else. Then I booked a flight back to Iowa. The law office was on a quiet street 2 blocks from the Cedar Falls courthouse. The attorney who met me was Gerald Holt, somewhere in his late 60s, unhurried in the way of someone who had learned that people sitting across from him needed time more than efficiency. He confirmed my identity, explained that my father had retained him privately 8 years earlier without Diane's knowledge, and handed me a sealed folder along with directions to a bank branch on the east side of town. He said my father had been very deliberate about keeping everything outside the estate. I asked if he knew what was inside the box. He said he knew enough to understand why Warren had kept it hidden for 8 years, and that he was sorry it had taken this long to reach me. The bank was a 15-minute drive. I sat in the parking lot before going inside, the sealed folder on the passenger seat beside me. I had spent 15 years moving toward difficult things rather than away from them. But sitting in that parking lot, I felt like a child again, 13 years old, standing at the top of the stairs, looking at a bag by the front door. The manager led me to a private room and placed the box on the table. Inside were 4 thick folders, 2 sealed envelopes with my name on them, and a leather journal with my father's initials on the cover. The first folder contained a document on the letterhead of a psychiatric evaluation center in Des Moines, dated 3 weeks before the night my father sent me away. It described a 13-year-old girl with severe behavioral disorders, a history of violent episodes, and a clinical recommendation for immediate removal from the family home. The patient's name was Claire Donovan. I had never been to that center. I had never been evaluated by that physician. I had never had a violent episode in my life. The second folder contained a report from a private investigator my father had hired 7 years after I left. The investigator had located the physician whose signature appeared on the evaluation. The physician had no memory of evaluating a patient named Claire Donovan because he never had. His signature was a forgery. The handwriting analysis in the report identified the source as matching 2 other documents in the folder, both signed by Diane. My father's journal filled in the rest. Warren had believed the document completely. Diane had shown it to him during a period when he was already emotionally exhausted, already inclined to trust her judgment over his own. She told him the evaluation center had recommended immediate action, that waiting would put their younger children at risk, and that she had handled all the arrangements. He believed her. He wrote that he had known something was wrong almost immediately after I left, not something he could name, just a weight that never lifted. He tried to contact me twice in the first year through channels Diane controlled. Both attempts went nowhere. It took him 6 years to start asking the questions he should have asked the night it happened. By then he didn't know where to begin or whether undoing any of it was possible. He hired Gerald. He hired the investigator. He built a record because he knew that if he came to me with only words, I would never believe him. He was right. I opened the first sealed envelope last. It contained 23 letters my father had written to me over 15 years and never sent. The earliest was dated 4 months after the night he sent me away. It began with 2 words, "I'm sorry." I read all 23. By the time I finished the last one, the morning light through the small window had shifted to early afternoon. I placed everything back carefully, the way my father had arranged it, and sat in the quiet of that room for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone and called my office in Chicago. My supervising partner at the firm, a woman named Judith Crane who had handled complex civil litigation for 30 years, listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before saying 2 things. First, that what I had described constituted fraud of a severity that went well beyond a family dispute. Second, that I should not touch anything else in that box until I had spoken with an attorney who had no personal connection to the case. She recommended a colleague in Des Moines who specialized in civil fraud and estate litigation, and said she would make the call herself before the end of the day. I drove back to Patrice's house that evening and sat at her kitchen table the way I had sat there at 13 years old, except this time I wasn't shaking. I laid out what I had found and watched her face move through expressions she was trying to control. When I finished, she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she told me she had always known something wasn't right about the night Warren sent me away. She said he had called her once, about 2 months after, and that he had sounded like a man who had done something he couldn't explain even to himself. She had never told me because she didn't know what to do with information that incomplete. I told her it made sense now. Everything made sense now. The Des Moines attorney was named Patricia Okafor, and she was exactly what Judith had described, precise, experienced, and entirely unmoved by the emotional weight of the situation in a way that made her immediately useful. I met with her the following morning and spent 3 hours walking her through every document in the box. She asked methodical questions, photographed everything, and said very little until I finished. Then she told me the forged psychiatric evaluation alone was sufficient to pursue criminal fraud charges against Diane, and that the financial documentation in the 3rd folder, which I had not yet fully processed, appeared to describe a pattern of business fraud that would need to be examined by a forensic accountant before she could assess the full scope. I had not properly read the 3rd folder in the bank room. I had been focused on the psychiatric evaluation and my father's journal and had set the financial documents aside. That evening at Patrice's table, I went through them carefully for the first time. What they contained was a 7-year record my father had quietly assembled of irregularities in his logistics company, transfers to accounts he hadn't authorized, invoices from vendors that didn't exist, expense approvals bearing his signature that he hadn't signed. The amounts were not dramatic in any individual instance. Across 7 years, they were considerable. At the back of the folder was a handwritten note in my father's careful print listing 3 former employees by name, with a single sentence beneath each name. This person knows what they saw. I called all 3 the following day. The first 2 didn't answer. The third was a former office manager named Dennis Chu who had left the company 9 years earlier under circumstances he described as uncomfortable. He was cautious on the phone until I explained who I was and what I had found. Then he became very still in the way that people become still when they've been waiting a long time for a conversation and aren't sure they trust it yet. He said he had noticed irregularities in the accounts during his last year at the company and had raised them with Warren directly. Warren had told him Diane handled that side of the business and that Dennis should bring his concerns to her. When Dennis did, He was let go 2 weeks later with a severance agreement that included a non-disclosure clause he had signed because he had a family to support and no appetite for a legal fight he wasn't sure he could win. He still had copies of the documents he had been concerned about. He had kept them for 9 years in a folder in his home office because something told him they might matter one day. I asked if he would be willing to speak with Patricia Okafor. He said he had been willing for 9 years and that nobody had ever asked. Patricia filed the initial fraud complaint with the Iowa Attorney General's office the following week, supported by the forged evaluation, the financial records, my father's journal, Dennis Chu's documentation, and the private investigator's handwriting analysis. The complaint named Diane and Richard jointly. The financial records tied Richard's name to several of the fraudulent vendor accounts in ways that the 7 years of careful documentation made difficult to explain as coincidence. Diane called me the day after the complaint was filed. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that was 3 minutes long and that I listened to once before forwarding it to Patricia without responding. The voicemail was not a confession, and it was not an apology. It was a performance, measured, wounded, designed to sound like a reasonable person reaching out to a grieving stepdaughter. Patricia said it was the kind of message that looked very different in a legal context than it was intended to look, and that I had done exactly the right thing by not responding. Richard did not call. His attorney contacted Patricia's office the following morning, which told me everything about how seriously he was taking the situation. The Attorney General's investigation moved with the deliberate pace of a process that could not be rushed without being weakened. Patricia explained this early, and I accepted it the way I accepted difficult timelines at work, not with patience, but with the understanding that urgency applied in the wrong direction produces mistakes that cost more time than they save. The civil case ran parallel. Patricia filed a fraud claim against Diane and Richard jointly, seeking damages covering the financial losses to my father's estate and compensatory damages related to the forged psychiatric evaluation. A forged document had removed a 13-year-old from her home and severed a father-daughter relationship for 15 years. Patricia said it was the strongest compensatory claim she had seen in her career. The forensic accountant she engaged was a retired federal examiner named Howard Banks. He spent 6 weeks with the company records, Dennis Chu's documentation, and subpoenaed financials going back 12 years. His report was 93 pages. The methodology had been consistent throughout: fraudulent vendor accounts in Richard's name or connected shell companies, invoices routed through authorization controls Diane managed. The total extracted across 11 years was significantly larger than my father's private records had suggested. Patricia said the number quietly when she called rather than putting it in a text. Dennis Chu's documentation aligned precisely with Howard's findings. 2 other former employees eventually returned my calls and agreed to provide formal statements. Both described the same experience: noticing something wrong, raising it internally, and finding themselves gone from the company within months. The criminal investigation accelerated after Howard's report reached the Attorney General's office. Search warrants were executed on Diane and Richard's financial accounts. Richard's attorney filed a motion challenging the warrants that was denied within a week. Diane's attorney requested a meeting to discuss a negotiated resolution. I told Patricia I wasn't interested in anything that didn't include full public acknowledgement and full accountability for both of them. Patricia said the evidence supported maintaining that position. What I hadn't prepared for was the second sealed envelope from my father's safety deposit box. I had set it aside during my first visit and returned to it 3 weeks into the legal process. It contained a single letter written 6 months before his death. He wrote that he had driven to Chicago twice in the previous 4 years and parked outside my office building without going in, because he couldn't find a version of that conversation that didn't begin with him asking me to forgive something that might be unforgivable. He called those 2 trips the cowardice he would carry for whatever time he had left. Then he wrote that he had followed my career through public records and professional announcements. He knew I had graduated law school. He knew the name of my firm. He wrote that the work I did finding truth inside complex financial records was something he recognized as entirely mine, entirely earned, and entirely consistent with the daughter he remembered standing at the top of those stairs 15 years earlier. He said he was proud of me in a way he had never been able to say out loud. I folded the letter and sat at Patrice's kitchen table for a long time without moving. The anger I had carried for 15 years didn't leave me that evening. But it shared space now with something more complicated, the grief of understanding a person too late, and the sadness of a relationship destroyed not by the failure of love, but by the success of someone else's lie. Diane and Richard were formally charged 4 months after the Attorney General's office received Howard's report. The charges against Diane included document forgery, fraud, and conspiracy. Richard faced charges of financial fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy connected to the 11 years of systematic extraction from my father's company. Both were processed on the same Tuesday morning, which Patricia said was deliberate. Investigators had coordinated the timing to prevent either of them from warning the other. The arraignment was held in a Cedar Falls courtroom on a gray November morning. I sat in the gallery and watched both of them walk in separately with their attorneys. Diane looked composed in the specific way she had always looked: composed, controlled, careful, performing calm for whoever was watching. Richard looked older than I remembered and less certain of himself, which was the first time I had seen him without the easy confidence that had made my father trust him. They didn't look at each other. They didn't look at me. The charges were read and both entered not guilty pleas, which Patricia had expected. What happened next moved faster than either of their legal teams had anticipated. Howard's report was comprehensive enough that the prosecution's evidentiary position was strong from the beginning, and Dennis Chu's formal statement combined with the 2 additional witness accounts closed the gaps that might otherwise have created doubt. Richard's attorney approached the prosecution about a plea arrangement 6 weeks after the arraignment. The negotiation took 3 weeks. Richard pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation against Diane and a detailed account of how the financial fraud had been structured and executed over 11 years. Diane went to trial. I attended every day. I sat in the same seat in the gallery and watched the prosecution lay out 11 years of documented fraud with the methodical precision of people who had spent months preparing to be unignorable. Howard Banks testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through the financial records in plain language that required no accounting background to follow. Dennis Chu testified about what he had seen and what had happened when he raised his concerns. The 2 other former employees testified about their own experiences. The handwriting analyst testified about the forged psychiatric evaluation with a specificity that left no meaningful room for alternative interpretation. Diane's attorney worked hard. The defense argued that Richard had operated independently of Diane's knowledge, that the financial irregularities reflected poor oversight rather than deliberate fraud, and that the psychiatric evaluation had been obtained in good faith from a source that had subsequently proven unreliable. Each argument was addressed directly by the prosecution with documentation that contradicted it. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. The verdict came back on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on all counts. I was sitting in the gallery when the foreperson read it. I had imagined this moment many times over the previous months and had always expected to feel something large and immediate: relief or satisfaction, or the specific release of something that had been held too long. What I actually felt was quieter than any of those things. It was simply the recognition that something which had been wrong for 15 years had been corrected, and that the correction had come too late to give back what was lost, but had arrived in time to matter. Diane was sentenced 8 weeks later. Richard's sentencing followed 2 weeks after that, reduced in recognition of his cooperation. The civil case resolved through a settlement negotiated in the weeks between the verdict and the sentencing. The settlement covered the financial losses to my father's estate, the legal costs of the investigation, and compensatory damages that Patricia had argued for with the specificity the evidence supported. The number was significant. I sat with it for several days before deciding what to do with it. My father's logistics company was liquidated as part of the estate process. The remaining assets, combined with the civil settlement, were distributed according to Warren's will, a document Gerald Holt had helped him prepare privately in the same period he had been building the evidence in the safety deposit box. The will was specific and deliberate. Diane received nothing. The estate passed to Claire Donovan as sole beneficiary. I stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing was complete and called Patrice. She answered on the second ring, and I told her it was done. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she wished Warren had found the courage to do this while he was still alive. I told her I did too. Then I told her I was coming to her house for dinner, and that I would stop and pick up something on the way. She said she would put the kettle on. The first thing I did with the settlement money was pay off Patrice's mortgage. I didn't ask her permission or give her the opportunity to argue. I called her bank, arranged the payoff, and told her over dinner the same evening. She put down her fork, looked at me for a long moment, and said it wasn't necessary. I told her it was the only thing I was completely certain about. She didn't argue further. She cried quietly while washing the dishes and pretended she wasn't. The second thing I did was visit my father's grave. It was a cold Saturday morning in early December. The cemetery was quiet. I stood in front of his headstone with my hands in my coat pockets and told him I had read every letter, all 23 of the ones he never sent, and the final one from the sealed envelope. I told him I understood now what had happened, and that understanding it didn't erase the years, but changed the shape of them. I told him the work he had done quietly over 8 years, building the record, protecting the evidence, had mattered more than he could have known while he was doing it. Then I told him I forgave him. Not completely and not without grief, because forgiveness that costs nothing means nothing. But enough to put down the version of him I had carried since I was 13, the flat voice, the pointing finger, the bag by the front door, and replace it with the fuller one. The man who made pancakes on Saturday mornings. The man who drove to Chicago twice and couldn't make himself go in. The man who had written 23 letters and kept every one of them because throwing them away felt like giving up. I stood at that grave until the cold became impossible to ignore. When I turned to leave, I felt lighter in the specific way that comes not from happiness, but from releasing something carried so long it had started to feel like part of the body. The foundation came together over the following months. I worked with a nonprofit attorney in Chicago and brought Patrice in as the founding board member because the idea had always been as much hers as mine. The foundation provided legal advocacy and housing support for minors removed from family homes under circumstances that warranted independent review. It was specific, unglamorous work that happened in courtrooms and social services offices, and it required exactly the skill set I had spent 15 years developing without knowing why. The first case was a 12-year-old girl in eastern Iowa whose removal from her home had been initiated on a distorted account provided by a step-parent. The case took 8 months. When it resolved, she went back to her father. The attorney who handled it called me the same evening, and I sat at my desk for a long time after without doing anything else. I thought about the 13-year-old who had stood at the top of those stairs with no one in the room asking the right questions. The foundation wasn't going to fix what had happened to me. Nothing was. But it was going to be in the room for other people at the moment that mattered, and that was the most honest use I could imagine for everything the past 15 years had built.